This week, our speaker is David McNay, and he is presenting from Salt Lake City in Utah. He is a park rec and tourism PhD student. And so I'm going to pass the mic off to David.
As Clemencia said, I'm a PhD student at the University of Utah. And I just want to do a brief introduction and kind of jump into some research that I'm involved in that's very nature-oriented, and I'm pretty excited to talk about. I'm originally from Virginia, but I've kind of lived all over the country. I spent a lot of time up in the summers in Maine, and my bachelor's is from here in Utah as well, and I'm back to Utah. Lived some time in California and Texas and Washington doing experiential education or outdoor education, environmental education. And my master's degree is from Minnesota in experiential education.
David, we're not seeing your presentation screen. If you want to just hit the...
I'm worried if I blow it up, then I won't be able to see chats, but maybe that's not a problem.
Yeah, I'm happy to keep an eye on it for you. I can always interrupt you if I think there's something inadvertent.
Okay, great. Well, then let's give it a go. All right. I like to think of the research we're doing as the cognitive benefits of nature. I'm sure many of you, or if not all of you, have had experiences in nature where you come home and you feel restored, or you feel really, really good. And it's hard to articulate what that is and what that feels like. And there's a lot of people around the world, in Asia in particular, in Scandinavia, that are studying what are these benefits. Let's put our finger on what these benefits actually are. And there are cognitive ways that we feel better, and there are physical ways that we feel better. And then our mood, this effectively means our mood. Our mood feels better when we're in nature. And some of the biophysical things that we get out of nature, a lot of them come from Japan, where they have forest bathing, if you're familiar with forest bathing or shin-in-yoku. And they found that blood pressure goes down, your immune system goes up, your overall stress level goes down when you're in nature. These are some of the physical effects that we receive when we're out in nature. And a lot of these tend to extend beyond the time we're in nature, where blood pressure will stay lower for several weeks after your immune system will still be up several weeks after your time there. We also have the mood benefits of nature. There's been a lot of research on particular depression, where they found that the incidences of depression are higher in urban areas than in rural areas or natural areas or suburbs. And this is increasing because more and more of us are living in larger cities than moving out to the suburbs. So as cities get bigger, then we're worried that the incidences of mental health are going to increase if we don't use nature in some way to help buffer against that. And then just generally mood, we're happier when we're in nature, when we come out of nature. And what my lab, what I'm interested in is what's going on in the brain. What are the cognitive benefits that we get out of nature? And there's these are just 3 studies that were done that improve our creative reasoning. If you want a backpacking trip here, you think more creatively. And then there's all these different tasks that they do in psychology. And the backwards digit span is I read a few numbers to you, and you have to tell them back to me in reverse order, which gets pretty tough when you get up into 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 numbers that I'm throwing at you. But they found that after you spend time in nature, you're better at that. You can remember more numbers. And all these different tasks that we're better at after we spent time in nature. So we're starting to, this research is kind of in its infancy still, just for a few decades, and some of these are very, very recent. You'll see we're starting to really understand scientifically, very subjectively, what benefits we get from being in nature, which is super exciting, and that's something that I'm excited to be a part of. One of the main theories that we use is called attention restoration theory, started by the Kaplans out of Michigan a few decades ago. And the big idea is that as we're using our mental resources, our attention, as we focus on a task like a homework assignment, then there's a limit to how much we can focus before our brain is just so fatigued we can't think about it anymore. And probably you felt this way. I certainly felt this way in school. What we have to do is find a way to restore this attention so that we can go back and focus on our tasks again. And what the Kaplans found is that there are 4 characteristics of environments that we go to that help us restore our attention. And mostly these are mostly easily found in nature, and so that's kind of where this all ties back into nature, but these are not necessarily exclusive to nature. And these 4 characteristics are stepping away from whatever is drawing your attention, whatever is forcing you to focus on something, whether that be your job or a task or something like that. That allows your brain to kind of relax and start to restore, as opposed to like a muscle focusing on something. And then the environment has to hold some type of fascination for you. And we call it soft fascination. It has to be something about this environment that's interesting to you. And we kind of contrast that between urban and natural environments. And if you're taking a walk on a sidewalk in an urban city, then there's a lot going on. There's architecture, there's plants and people and cars and things like that. There's things that can hold your attention, capture your attention, that you can think about, that you have to focus on at some level. And if it's a low enough level, then it can be restorative. But there are certain aspects in an urban environment that draw our attention very hard, or make us focus. Like if you're walking along a sidewalk and a car horn goes off, you immediately attend to that to find out if that's something you need to worry about. Is that someone honking at me, or is there something I need to be worried about from a safety standpoint? In contrast, in a natural environment, so suppose if you imagine you're walking along a sidewalk next to a lake, there are a lot of things that can hold your attention, from water or animals, birds on the water, birds in the sky. There's lots of different plants and plant life to be attending to, things like that. But none of these require your attention. That if you hear bird songs, then it's interesting, but you don't have to worry about it. And you can obviously imagine there's some natural settings where you do have to worry a little bit more. So there is kind of a spectrum of that. But in order for our brain to relax, we have to have these things that are interesting enough that it holds a little bit of our attention in a fascination way, as opposed to focusing on it like a task. Another characteristic is what we call an extent, which is the complexity of the environment. And the best way to conceptualize this is a virtual reality environment. That if you've ever seen a virtual reality, you've been in one of those environments, there's some things that are just not as complex as they are in real life. For example, a tree. It's really hard for the computer to present a tree to you in a way that looks just like a tree, that feels just like a tree. And there's this disconnect between knowing it's a tree and what you see. And this coherence comes into it as this disconnect. The environment has to make sense. So if you were to go into an environment, a natural environment, where you had trees that were out of place, it would be confusing to you, and it is not restorative. It's a little bit hard to conceptualize that, but hopefully you can kind of get a little hint of how that can be a restorative or a non-restorative environment. So that has to be there so that it helps hold your fascination. And these environments also have to be compatible with us on some level. So part of this is preference. But a lot of this is, what am I going into this environment looking for? The goals that I'm looking for. Am I looking for a relaxing and experience versus am I going to hike 25 miles today and I've got to really focus on that or focus on something? Then it can be a non-restorative environment. And there's a lot of discussion on what that means and what qualifies as compatibility. So this is still of a developing theory in some ways. But hopefully you can see that nature really holds these characteristics almost more than most other environments. So a good way for us to restore our attention so that we can work on our tasks again at a highest level is to spend time in nature. And there's a few papers out there, even very recently, about where do you go on campus to on a study break. So simple things like that can really make a big difference in our lives on a short-term level. One of the things that the attention restoration theory does not do is it doesn't really speak to what's going on in the brain. The whole idea of restoration is in some ways a slightly vague concept when it comes to what's going on in the brain. And so part of our research is, and all of the research that goes on is what does it really mean? What is restoration? What does it look like in the brain? And how are we getting that? I want to give a quick introduction to the lab I work in. This is a psychology lab. I am a recreation person, so I have had to learn a whole lot more neuroscience than I had to know before, which is exciting. But it is primarily it is a psychology research lab that really has two arms to it. The distracted driving is a major part, especially where funding comes in. So a lot of research projects on texting and driving and how our attention is being utilized or drained and while we're driving. So a quick plug for Don't Text and Drive. One of the things that has been found is that if you stop at a red light and you pull out your phone, you text, you put your phone down, the light turns green, your attention is still on your phone, on that text that you received. And some numbers go as far as 40 seconds later. So you could be starting to drive and your attention is still on that phone. So don't text and drive. It's real. It's a thing. And if you go to our website, there's a whole lot of research and publications about how that's the case and all the different things. The other cool thing that we do is insurance companies have been interested in autonomous vehicles and how that affects our attention. And the reality is that we're not attending the way we normally would when the vehicle is driving autonomously. So that will definitely be an interesting thing as autonomous vehicles become a lot more prevalent in our society, and how we deal with those and how much the insurance companies are willing to pay for autonomous vehicles. And so that's an interesting thing that's coming out soon. I wanted to introduce the research team in our lab. So hopefully this will work okay. Because I don't want you to think that I'm the expert in the lab, because as I said, I'm a recreation person. I love this stuff, but I just don't know everything. The main faculty member in charge of the lab is David Strayer. He has been highlighted in National Geographic articles and outdoor magazine articles and some videos and things like that, as well as if you're familiar with the Nature Fix by Florence Williams. He's highlighted in that several chapters, and actually we take a trip, and Florence Williams attended one of those trips to do research. We have a lot of great graduate students in the lab. I wanted to highlight Sarah Lotemplio, who actually is from your neck of the woods. She grew up just on the other side of Lake Champlain in upstate New York and went to school at Colby College in Maine. And she's a huge proponent of women in STEM and women in research. So I just wanted to give that plug too, that I work with some amazing women, some super brilliant women and men, and they really kind of guide this research in a lot of ways. And so I'm trying to catch up to them in some ways. And I'll see if I can jump back. We also on our website, as I say, have lots of publications. There's a lot of links to articles and highlights of this research as well as the driving research. And I wanted to share a video that we produced.
It's hard to place measurable value on nature. We all know that being in nature makes us feel better, but what we don't know is why. It's the Applied Cognition Lab's primary objective to find the answer to this question. We're currently doing a study to determine how nature affects the brain. We bring participants on a 4-day camping trip to the San Juan River near Moab, Utah. We lead hikes to Anasazi ruins and around the gorgeous protected lands of southern Utah. We also have meals prepared fresh daily by our camp cook, compensate for travel from Salt Lake City, and we pay participants for their time. We measure participants' brain activity on simple tasks before, during, and after the trip in order to see if there is any change in brain functioning as a result of immersion in nature. These studies require time, energy, and interest, but most importantly, they require participation. None of what we're trying to accomplish is possible without participants who are willing to join the study. By doing so, you help us better understand the natural world and our place in it. We'd like you to join us as a participant on our next research trip. Please reach out to the Applied Cognition Lab today. We can't wait to experience this with you.
So one of the primary ways we do research is by taking students or other participants on this camping trip down in southern Utah. And we're using EEG, electroencephalography, with electrodes on people's scalps to measure these different tasks and to measure what's going on in the brain. So it's a super fun research project to be involved in because we get to go camping and hiking in really cool places. You may not think that the desert is cool, but it's super, super cool. And the ruins, the Native American ruins and petroglyphs and the nature that's there is all makes it a really awesome trip to be on. And in our research lab, we have a lot of research assistants. You got a pretty good picture of some of the ruins, but I just wanted to throw some of these pictures in there and see how beautiful it is and see these cool ruins. And in this picture, you probably can't tell, but we're all trying to make pictures of brain waves on the right-hand side. It was funny at the time. I want to talk a little bit more about what we're actually doing in this research. There's a question in the chat, and if it's all right, I'm going to hold that until later, if that's all right. So as mentioned in the video, we do a pre-test, a test during the trip, and then we test afterwards. So the pre and the post is done as in this lower picture on the left in front of a concrete wall. You're in a pod to protect you from the elements with a computer in front of you, and you're doing computer tasks that elicit brain waves. And brain waves, if you're looking at them, kind of have these giant squiggly things going on. But there's a lot more information than just these squigglies. And so one of the big things we're looking for are specific jumps or bumps in the brainwave that are a result from what's going on in the task. And in particular, one of the biggest one we're looking at is when you make an error on the task, how does that change your brainwave? So one of the main tasks that we've been using for several years is called the flanker task. So on the screen, you see a list of letters, 5 letters, H, 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 H. And your job is to push a key if you see an H. Or if it's a S in the middle, you push an S in the middle. And sometimes the letters on the outside of the middle, which is the one you're supposed to be focusing on, attending to, sometimes they're the same, sometimes they're different, which causes you to make mistakes. And we can see that in your brainwave. So that's super interesting. And in the kind of the middle picture here, this is our testing site. You probably saw it. You're sitting in a pod, watching the river, looking over the river. Super peaceful, pretty cool. And there's also no view of anything man-made looking across that river. That's all wild space. And this third picture, I'm hoping you can see, kind of tell. I've got a few pictures of participants and often research assistants in these EEG setups. And so you can see on the right, we've got several electrodes along her midline that we've taped down, as well as some on their face. And some of those are ground to help us with the electrical signal. And some of those are to help with blinks. Whenever you make a muscle movement like a blink, it shows up really strongly in your brain waves. That can make it difficult to process the brain waves. I'm going to jump back to a lot of these questions in a later, so that's going to be good. Okay. Here's kind of a picture of what we're looking at down at the bottom. So there's zero axis. On the x-axis is when you are presented a stimulus, or in this case, this might be your response. And in this gray band, we're seeing in the darker level, you see this jump on how the brain is aware that you made a mistake. That's what that's signifying. And you can see that the lighter gray, I did make a mistake, and the brainwave just continues as normal. Sometimes this is, you're not necessarily aware that you made a mistake, but your brain is aware that you made a mistake. That's an interesting little subtlety there that doesn't necessarily come out in the data, but your brain is aware when you made a mistake. And this signal comes primarily from the central part of the brain, where it's blue here. This is a funny graph because negative is up. It's an error-related negativity. And then blue is showing that it's in the negative direction as well. There are some other things that are going on that may affect how you do on these tasks that I just want to kind of briefly mention, like your motivation to how strongly you want to do on this, how well you want to do on this task can affect how much that amplitude of the error signal changes. And there's some indication that the glucose is one of the things that we need in our brain to help us maintain that functioning, and it can affect the peak, the amplitude of that as well. And this is what it looks like in the difference between the pre and the post and the during. So you can see that this camp testing, we've done several, we have done several studies with differing results. And so there's a lot of complexity in what's going on. So we don't know all the answers yet, for sure. But you can see this negativity. In this case, negative is down. EEG research are flip-floppy on that. So our error-related negativity, the amplitude of your brain sensing that you've made an error when you're in nature is lower in this case. And there's no difference between before the trip or after the trip when you're in an urban environment looking at a concrete wall. There seems to be very little difference in that. And we see a much larger difference, a significant difference of a lower amplitude. And we have had results that suggest the other way around, that the amplitude when you're in nature is larger than your pre-test, and in some cases the same as your post-test, which suggests that the effect is a little bit longer lasting, that can last a week or two to post-testing. But these contradictory results also kind of add some questions. And this is what happens in research. Sometimes you get contradictory results. You've got to figure out what's going on. And I think it potentially could suggest two different things. So if you are restored, your mental resources are restored, then it would suggest that the amplitude could be larger, that your brain could respond more strongly to the to an error, or potentially means that you're far more motivated. For example, a lot of the participants we have are very interested in nature having a definable effect. So they're more motivated to do it well on these tasks. And so maybe that motivation is what's increasing the amplitude of their signal. But what we also might expect is that you're more relaxed in nature. And this would be more of an example of that, where we call this kind of the 3-day effect, that when you're out in nature, it takes a few days, or it takes some time for your body and your mind to kind of relax and rest and get in time or in tune with nature. And so you're you care less about what time it is, for example. That can matter a lot less. And so it may be that this particular example, these particular results are showing that when you're in nature, the amplitude actually goes down because you're less worried about making a mistake. So that's research for you. Sometimes you have contradictory results that show something, but it's hard to necessarily interpret, and they can be completely contradictory. So that can be difficult in nature studies. I do want to point out that as far as we're aware, there are almost no labs. I'm aware of one other lab that does EEG research that's trying to understand brain waves while they're in nature, and that's a recreation lab out of Tennessee, and they're doing very, very different things. So we're one of the few labs in the world that's doing these kinds of things. So it's exciting to be on that kind of cutting edge, but there's just not enough time to go camping in our lives. And so research, it turns out, is not instantaneous. It takes time, preparation, and planning, and then analyzing the data and things like that. And so the research generally is pretty much in its infancy, and there's so many different things that might be going on in the brain that might be affected by nature that we just haven't had time yet to study, which is exciting, which means that there's more things to study in the future. There are a lot of questions about, and in the chat window I can already see there's some questions about what about this and what about that. Those are great questions. We love hearing those questions, but often those are questions of we haven't gotten to it yet. And for me in particular, I think the different environments is a very interesting question. The environment in northern Vermont is substantially different than the desert in southern Utah. And it'd be very interesting to see what the results would be based on that difference. And then you also point out in the chat, I can just glance at and see there are other confounds about, what about people that live in nature all the time or work in nature? Will they still see these same effects? And the answer is we just don't know yet. We haven't had a chance to check those out, but that's a great question. We'd love to know. And I just want to point out that the pandemic really has put a damper on our research. Because we're doing EEG research, we're putting electrodes on people's heads. It's just not safe for us to do that right now. So we actually, this spring, we're in the middle of our main research project and 2 major research projects that we had started and just had to shut down. And that's research. That's kind of an interesting little twist on research. So let me get to some questions, I think. That sounds all right. I'm going to kind of go in order. I haven't read these over quite yet, so let's kind of go in order. Is there a limit to how long restorative properties of nature can last? Yes, although that's not 100% clear how long some effects last. Some of the physical effects have been shown to last up to several weeks. One of the problems that we've had in our past research is that we take students out at the end of the semester and we go on this camping trip for 5 days and they're all restored and it's awesome, and they come back and it's immediately finals. And whatever restoration, whatever mental capacities they've restored, they're immediately using those up in finals, and then we test them during finals and all that restoration has gone back down. So yeah, there's a lot going on to how much that can last. And there's also questions about dosage. So how long do you need to be in nature before you see a result? Or how frequently do you need to go out into nature before you see a long-term result or an effect? And those are all questions that are super interesting. And there is some research on those. Some suggesting that 15 minutes is good for, depending on the result you're looking for, is enough to feel a difference. And some research suggests that it has to be over a course of weeks or days that you're getting the maximum benefits for. So there is some research on that, but we just don't know the final answer on that. Dosage is something that everybody's interested in and doing research on currently. And does it vary between person and person? That's a great question that we don't have an answer yet. The way that a lot of EEG research is you average everyone's brainwaves together. And since everyone has slightly different brainwaves, then we would expect to see some variation in that, but it's hard to make larger claims on that. So there is some difference between person to person, and we would expect that based on their experience with nature. But we just don't know. That's definitely a question that we just don't have an answer to yet. So this next question, people that work outside. So we hear like construction crews, road construction, like the person that's out there standing the sign, holding the sign, the stop sign and the yield sign. That's a great question that we don't have an answer to. But from a theoretical standpoint, they are very focused on their job. At some level, they're focused on their job, and so that environment is not necessarily a restorative environment for them. But when they get off work, or any of us finishes our work and we go into a restorative environment, there's a difference in how our brain is functioning there. So we don't know the answer to that, but there's some suggestion there would be a difference if their job is outside. Memory, there's only a little bit of data on memory at this point, and so it does suggest that we will have better memories, but I don't know that we really compared it to a desk job. That's there's not a lot of data between subjects, if that makes sense. We're not really comparing one person to another person. That was actually one of our main projects this spring that got canceled, was trying to set up a controlled setting where we can compare between settings, between people that way, and it's hard and just hasn't happened yet. Enjoyment of work, that speaks to compatibility in some ways, and those are good questions that we just don't know the answer to yet. When it comes to people, so there's questions about neurological conditions. That's absolutely something we just don't know the answer to. But it kind of speaks to how different people relate to wilderness. That some people have really high place attachment, or really love a specific type of nature, or culturally, a certain culture might respond differently to nature. It holds a different place, like in Japan, where they're not necessarily as far from nature in some settings. There's been most of the research comes out of Japan. The forest bathing originated in Japan. So these interpersonal differences are very interesting, and intercultural differences, and even socioeconomic differences, gender differences, race differences. These are categories of people that we all experience nature very differently, or potentially differently, and it leads to the question: does it affect us in the same way? Does it affect our brains in the same way or different way? And that's an awesome question that no one has tackled yet, that I'm aware of. It actually, if I can go on a little bit of a tangent, there has been some work with brain development in children and stress that's related to brain development in their environment, socioeconomically, and nature can be a buffer so that the stress doesn't affect their brain development in some ways. And so one of the things that has unfortunately been found is that brain development is hindered by high amounts of stress in children that have due to racism and due to socioeconomic situations. And nature could be a buffer against that level of stress and help that effect be not as strong, which is an awesome result to come out of this research. Is how do we help children in that way? But definitely bears more research. Next half of that question has harder to focus on their attention on something because of the nature and noises around them. I think different people are familiar with nature in different levels. I've spent a lot of time in nature, and so it's easier for me to understand what's going on and relax and be in a natural setting versus someone who doesn't have that experience, doesn't know the plants, isn't familiar with the plants and things like that. And I think that there's a difference there in that level of relaxation that you can achieve. I don't know if that's a great answer for that, but there are some. I was just talking with my parents about this, and they're talking about snakes. And if you're worried about snakes in nature, then your experience will be very different than if you're not. And different noises, you get to know whether that's a safe noise or a dangerous noise. So I think these are all speaking to whether that environment really is restorative or not. I think that's a lot of deep questions that we can get out of this. A question about how we select our participants. So there is a psychology course in here that it's an undergraduate course, and that's the course where they go on the camping trip for the course. And most students agree to participate in the research project in addition to that. And so primarily that's how we're recruiting participants for this. This class has been going on for about 10 years. And David Strayer has been teaching that. And then sometimes he's passed it on to graduate students the past few years. Some of the other students have taught that. We've done a little bit of testing outside of the university, where we invite all of our friends to go on this trip, or acquaintances, or announce it at a workplace or things like that. But it's really hard to recruit outside of the university in that way. But it's certainly something that would answer a lot of questions, because a university population is very limited in how well it represents the entire population of a city or a state or the country. And so it would be really nice to be able to talk about what are the effects to people all over the country. And if all you can do is recruit from a university population, you may be limited in your ability to apply that outside of that. It does take the whole process. We do a pretest that's about a week before the trip. The trip is 5 days, and then about a week after, we try and have people come back in. And so that whole process takes us as a lab 5-6 weeks to get everybody tested. And so we have had some people that have been interested in coming from out of state, but it's really difficult for them to come a week before the trip and then come back for the trip and then come back to do post testing. So we would love to have you all come out and participate, but it's really difficult. I think I've touched on a lot of these questions. Most common types of brain waves. I don't think that there's necessarily a type of brainwave that appears in nature and are more or less than in other areas. We do see, you probably have heard of alpha waves and gamma waves, beta waves, and they're different frequency bands of brain waves. Alpha waves tend to appear when you're more relaxed. The brain waves start to kind of spread out a little bit, but they're not restricted to nature. You see those in meditation as well, or mind wandering is another time where those kind of appear. So, and then when you're focusing on a task, you see more kind of beta and gamma waves. Delta waves are sleep waves, and I forget what the theta waves are all about. But so we wouldn't see specific brain waves or different potentials, different little spikes necessarily because of nature, but what we're looking for is differences in those spikes between a natural and an urban environment. Hopefully that answers that question. We definitely, this next question is about therapy, using nature as a therapy tool. And it has been used and is still currently used quite a bit. Not quite as much, I don't know much data about incarcerated individuals, but wilderness therapy is a thing and has been a thing for a long time. And I don't know that they definitely understand the science behind it, but it is effective for most individuals. And so even if you don't understand it, but you know it works, you still do it, right? I think there's a lot of that going on in our world. And but as far as advocating for nature-based therapies, I'm a huge fan. I think that that should be one of the outcomes of our research, both on a recreational standpoint, but also as a therapeutic standpoint. Advocating for recreation time in elementary schools and promoting break times at work or in college, things like that, but also promoting parks in our cities so that we still have the opportunities to have a natural space that we can go to. I think we'll see societal level benefits for those kinds of things. One of the research projects that we all love is David Strayer, about a decade ago, and his creativity study, where they went backpacking for 5 days, I think, or 5-day trip. And when they came back, he found that they're more creative when they came back, which is totally awesome. We'd love for everybody in the world to have that opportunity, but that's not practical. Not everybody can go on a backpacking trip or wants to. So the level of nature, this spectrum of how natural something is, how much nature you have access to opportunity-wise, varies quite a bit. And from a practical standpoint, most of our society doesn't have the opportunity for various reasons to go into a wilderness setting. And so the question then becomes, well, what kind of effects can we expect at a city park or a state park, or just going and playing outside in your backyard or something like that? These are all super big questions that I'm personally hoping that this research it can become an advocate for those things and improving those things for everyone, because I think these are societal level benefits that we all should share. Let's see, this next question. how would someone react to nature if they were traumatically affected by it in some way? And we're definitely talking about a restorative environment. And it's very clear that there are some situations where nature is not a restorative environment. So we can come back to race and socioeconomics, and trauma is also in that category of that may not be a restorative environment. And so the reactions can be very different. The overarching theory behind the benefits of nature is called biophilia, which simply means that humans evolutionarily have lived among nature. We always lived in nature, and now we're moving to the cities, and so we have this closeness or a love of nature is what the term translates to. And it's less clear as to if that's true or if what that means. But it kind of is this underlying idea in attention restoration theory. So if this is the case, then even people that have had trauma from nature have a strong aversion to nature, or just don't like nature, don't like being dirty, don't like getting out, or whatever, or like the video game generation, all these little different ways you might be able to categorize different people or different groups of people. If we believe in this idea of biophilia, then maybe they still will receive some type of benefit from being in nature, even if they don't like nature, if there's some aversion to it. But we just don't know. I think it's an interesting question. But also harkens back to some of the assumptions that we make as scientists. Where does our theory come from, and are our assumptions true or not? And those questions have not been answered yet. Dorm halls during quiet hours. It's hard to know if these would be similar to what we find in nature. Anytime you have this relaxation, according to attention restoration theory, anytime you find yourself in a restorative environment, you would anticipate some restoration. And we do see restoration like when you're asleep. There's obviously some restoration going on of these mental resources. And we also see something similar in meditation. People report that there has been restoration. However, the mechanisms for how these things appear are different. So in meditation, you're focusing on not focusing, if that makes sense. So you're utilizing your directed attention to keep your mind clear, which is kind of the opposite of attention restoration theory, where you're not focused on something. So even though the results may look similar, the mechanism for how we get there must be different, if that makes sense. Similar to other types of restoration, including sleep. It's not clear if the mechanisms in the brain are the same for all these different types of restoration. And can we say that simply relaxing is the same mechanism? Maybe, maybe not. It kind of depends on attention restoration theory. But again, this is another theory that it's not like the theory of gravity. We haven't proved this theory yet. It's hard to know if it's how much is true and what's true and all those kinds of things. Question about Southern Utah. I love talking about Southern Utah. It's beautiful down there. We are south of Moab, almost Arizona, and kind of the eastern corner. There's very small towns down there, and we just keep going down past Bluff and Blanding and to Bluff, essentially, in the little small town of Bluff, where there's no stoplights. Very near the Navajo reservation out there as well. In fact, across the river where the participants are looking, that's the reservation that's on the Navajo reservation in Utah. For this particular trip, we just do day hikes. We're at a public. It's not. It's near Grand Gulch, but it's not in Grand Gulch. So, one of the hikes we do, there's this great petroglyph of called the procession wall, where it's these little people that have drawn in to this center circle, which they think people represents a kiva, which is a ceremonial room, or it might be representative of a for the ancestral Pueblo. So it might also represent the people coming into like a festival, a religious festival, but they come from all directions, and it's this massive, 12, 15 foot long with little itty bitty people. At the top of this ridge, this cliff, this upturned upheaval of a rock. And so we hike up to the top of that, and there's actually, you can see where you actually look across the bluff and you can see Bears Ears, which you may be familiar with, which is in the Grand Gulch area. And we see that. And these pairs of objects like the Bears Ears are navigational tools for the ancestral Pueblans. And there's one in the city of the town of Bluff, as well as a giant kiva in the town of Bluff. And so it's thought that people came from the Bears Ears and cut up over this cliff. And you can see the evidence of where they've cut steps in this cliff in order to come up over the cliff and then continue on to the town of Bluff. And so that's one of the places we take our participants hiking. And there's all along this cliff, along this upturned rock, there's different generations of ruins going back to the 800 AD up to about 12 or 1300 AD is when they're in that area. Taking nature out of the equation. So, technically speaking, attention restoration theory is not about, it does not directly speak to nature, but just to restorative environments. It just so happens that nature holds the characteristics that make it pretty good. And so we definitely, relaxing areas, comfortable places in your home, you all can definitely find some very specific and very close to you examples of a restorative environment that's easily accessible to you. But it has to have these 4 characteristics, according to the theory, that you're away from your tasks, it's interesting to you, it's complex enough, or it makes sense, and it's compatible with what you're trying to get out of that area. So that option is definitely there. It's also possible, we don't know the answer, but that nature just simply is a better location because it holds those characteristics more naturally and more natively and more strongly. But we obviously get restoration in other ways in other places. And I love this question. Does it have to be familiar or a new experience? Because that's a big question that hasn't been answered. And that's all about compatibility or preference. So are you better restored in a desert or in a forest or on a mountain, on a lake, on the beach? Does it depend on where you grow up and where you're familiar with and what you prefer? These are very interesting questions that we just don't know the answer to yet. And as far as familiarity versus like new, that we just don't know. And interesting questions. Did I kind of hit on all the questions, or the other questions? Great.
Looks like that's all the questions. Anybody have any last thoughts they want to throw up there?
Thank you, David. We have one more question that popped up in the chat.
Yeah, beaches. I didn't address that. Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. You can definitely imagine that if you're at a beach, it's possible to not have to attend to everything that's going around you, but it's also possible that a running child or a screaming child is going to focus your attention. And so I think it has the potential of being a restorative environment, but it's not necessarily a restorative environment. I don't know if that kind of answers that question. Generally, I would say the fewer people around, the probably more likely it is that it's restorative. But it also asks the question, if you're a introvert or an extrovert, do you need to be, are you more restored being with people or being by yourself in nature? And I think that's an interesting question too that we don't have an answer for yet. I feel like there's a lot of questions that we have that in the future, hopefully you all help us answer. That we just we need to do more research.
Great. That is the end of our semester for current topics. So thank you for being our closing speaker. And
yeah, thanks for a great talk. That was really interesting. I can't wait to see what else you guys discover when you can get back out there in the field.
Yeah, it's definitely, I'm about to start my dissertation, and this is, the pandemic is affecting that, so.
Well, thanks everybody for your participation this semester. I hope everyone has a wonderful break, much deserved, and hope to see you back here next semester. Everybody take care and be safe.
That was beautiful. Thank you.
Thanks, Ethan.